In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahaski here, and today we'll look at America's involvement in the Second World War. In the 1930s, a global depression devastated economies around the world. Unemployment skyrocketed, and poverty and homelessness became commonplace. In the United States, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to tackle the problem with a sizable expansion of government, public works programs, and new regulations on the financial and banking system. In Europe, however, people took to more extreme measures. As the economic crisis deepened, some Europeans began to lose faith in their democracies, many of which had only been around since the end of the First World War. They rallied around charismatic and assertive figures like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, men who promised to usher in a new era of prosperity for their countrymen. But things spun quickly out of control. The intense nationalism that bred their popularity also fed their imperial ambition. Mussolini flexed his muscles with a takeover of Ethiopia. Hitler occupied the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. And in the Far East, Imperial Japan committed atrocities in China and elsewhere. When Hitler teamed up with the Soviet Union to split Poland down the middle, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany. Through it all, the League of Nations was nowhere to be found. Across the Atlantic, Americans were deeply disturbed by events in Europe. But the memory of World War I only reaffirmed their desire to stay out of the conflict. But as it had in World War I, that neutrality soon faded. American involvement in World War II is the subject of today's lecture. But first, let's ask a big question. Should the United States have dropped the atomic bomb on Japan? World War II was a global calamity. The conflict took the lives of 75 million people, two-thirds of whom were civilians. In August of 1945, tens of thousands of people were erased in a single moment when a 15-kiloton nuclear weapon exploded over the Japanese town of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the U.S. dropped an even larger bomb on Nagasaki. Though the deployment of the atomic bomb hastened the end of the war, the attacks ushered in the nuclear age, which has brought the planet to the brink of disaster on more than one occasion. Harry Truman's decision to drop the bomb continues to be a point of intense debate among civilians, military personnel, and historians. So, was it the right call? We'll need to take a closer look at the war before we decide. Now, throughout our discussion of the American experience in World War II, you'll notice striking parallels between the First and Second World Wars. Foremost among these parallels is the American inclination to stay out of the conflict when the war began. This is our first big idea. Though the United States declared neutrality at the war's outset, Hitler's advances in Europe brought the United States in line with the Allied powers. The U.S. officially joined the war after Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Hitler's aggression in Europe was no doubt a source of concern for many Americans, but in the late 30s, most people were far more concerned with the economic woes at home. Furthermore, the general consensus in the wake of the First World War was isolationism. Congress attempted to legislate neutrality, but over time, events in Europe pushed the United States towards the Allies. As tensions were rising overseas, Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1935. The law prohibited the United States from selling arms or issuing loans to warring nations. It was supposed to be a clear signal that the United States would not take sides in foreign disputes. However, things were changing quickly in Europe. In 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain that served as a proxy conflict for fascists, Republicans, and communists in Europe. Many believed, with good reason, that the Spanish Civil War could spill over into an international conflict. So Congress issued a new directive to fortify America's neutrality. The Neutrality Act of 1937 prohibited Americans from traveling on ships under the flag of warring nations. No doubt this was an attempt to prevent a repeat of the Lusitania incident of 20 years prior. But by 1939, the European situation deteriorated further. After years of appeasing Hitler, Britain and France officially declared war when Germany launched its invasion of Poland. At FDR's prodding, Congress passed a new law, the Neutrality Act of 1939, although this one was hardly neutral. The 1939 law lifted the embargo on military goods and established the doctrine of cash and carry. In other words, the U.S. could now sell arms and munitions to overseas buyers, provided that the purchasing country paid in cash and transported the product on their own ships. Now, while the law didn't explicitly favor Britain and France, FDR knew that Germany did not have the capability to pay cash for American-made weapons, so the legislation linked the United States with the Allies. Early in 1940, the Allied situation became dire. Hitler's takeover of France was nearly complete, and the only thing standing between Hitler and total control of Western Europe was Great Britain. Recognizing that democracy itself was in peril, the United States inched closer to intervention. In September 1940, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act, which established the first peacetime draft in the country's history. To many, the expansion of the U.S. military signaled the inevitability of American involvement. The following year, Congress gave FDR quasi-war-making powers with the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act permitted the president to distribute arms to the government of any country if deemed in the interest of U.S. national security. The law ended the cash and carry restriction and allowed the U.S. to provide war supplies to Great Britain on credit. As the president said in a 1940 fireside chat, the Lend-Lease Act rendered the United States the arsenal of democracy, and FDR began sending massive shipments of oil, weapons, and food to Great Britain, allowing that nation to swat away Hitler's advances until the U.S. was sufficiently prepared and sufficiently provoked to enter the fight. Similar to the way Abraham Lincoln carefully shepherded public opinion towards emancipation during the Civil War, Franklin Roosevelt methodically navigated a reluctant country towards intervention against Hitler and Imperial Japan. In January 1941, in his State of the Union address, FDR framed the European conflict as one on which the fate of freedom and democracy rested. In order to justify American support of Great Britain and the Allies, FDR outlined 4 freedoms that were being threatened by the Axis powers: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Now, we could spend days on this speech alone, but suffice it to say for now that the 4 freedoms laid the foundation for the American war effort. When the U.S. was finally provoked to join the war, its objectives had been clearly set. And that provocation did come, courtesy of the Japanese Empire. Tensions between the United States and Germany's ally in the Far East have been rising for years. Most recently, the United States had levied an oil embargo on Japan as a sanction against its imperial aggression in Asia. Starved of the critical resource, Japan was backed into a corner, and it acted boldly. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack against the U.S. naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was meticulously planned and almost flawlessly executed. And it was exactly what FDR needed to demand a war declaration from Congress. Only days after the United States declared war on Japan, Hitler declared war on the United States. And America's entrance into the 2 major theaters of World War II was official. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical success for Japan, and for a time it hobbled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, allowing for the Japanese to extend their territory across the Pacific. However, in the wake of the assault on Hawaii, its mastermind, Isoroku Yamamoto, foreshadowed a turn in the tide. He said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. This is our second big idea. The mass mobilization of American industrial resources, as well as the American people, provided a much-needed boost to the Allied war effort, helping to turn the tide in both the European and Pacific theaters. The sleeping giant to which Admiral Yamamoto referred was the industrial might of the United States. The unification of the American people against the Axis powers helped to jumpstart American industry. For the second time in the 20th century, the United States entered a total war economy. The incredible demand for ships, airplanes, and munitions lifted the U.S. out of the Great Depression, and war industries put the country's vast natural and mineral resources to work like never before. These pictures do far more justice to the scale of American war production than any statistics, but here are a few anyway. The United States built nearly 300,000 airplanes during the war. At peak production, one was being completed every 5 minutes. The U.S. produced more than 100,000 tanks, and a new warship was launched every 14 days. Only months after Pearl Harbor, the American fleet in the Pacific was again at attack strength. U.S. cryptographers were able to intercept and decode Japanese naval transmissions in March of 1942. With knowledge of the Japanese whereabouts, the Americans were able to launch an ambush in June near Midway Atoll. Caught by surprise, the Japanese were slow to respond, and all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk in the battle. The Battle of Midway was the most decisive naval battle of the entire war, and a turning point in the Pacific theater. The United States slowly began retaking Pacific Islands in the months and years that followed. And while American progress in the Pacific relied heavily on the machines of war, victory against Hitler in Europe would take that and more. It would require the full mobilization of the American people. The draft, which had begun in 1940, continued throughout the war, and a total of 16 million men served in the armed forces. As they had in World War I, women played a critical role in the war effort. Many left domestic spheres to occupy factory jobs vacated by enlisted men, and more than 350,000 women enlisted in the armed forces themselves. Each branch of the military opened an auxiliary department for women, and those women played critical logistic roles during the war. For example, women of the WASP division of the Air Force didn't fly combat missions, but they tested new airplanes, they ferried aircraft to forward bases, and they trained new pilots. The full bore of American mobilization, along with that of the Allies, was applied in Europe on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day. The D-Day invasion was the largest seaborne attack in the history of warfare. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops stormed the fortified beaches at Normandy on the northern coast of France. More than 60,000 of them were American. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Allies secured 5 beachheads that allowed them to launch a new offensive on the European continent. It was the turning point in the European theater, and a triumph of American and Allied mobilization. It was also the beginning of the end for Hitler. The final stages of the war, along with its dramatic conclusion, are outlined in our third big idea. Allied victory in Europe was achieved through cooperation between the United States, Britain, and Russia against Germany. In the Pacific theater, the war ended with the controversial deployment of the atomic bomb. The United States was instrumental in the war effort, but it would be an injustice to ignore the collective effort of the Allies. Great Britain endured constant bombardment during the Battle of Britain in 1940, but the resolve of the British people held, allowing for later coordination with the United States once America entered the war. And the lion's share of the fighting in Europe was actually done by the Russians. The Soviet Union mobilized their entire population and fought Nazi troops in unthinkable conditions. The Soviets suffered more casualties during the war than any other nation, by far, and their sacrifice served a strategic purpose of the utmost importance. By keeping Hitler's attention divided on the Eastern Front, American and British forces were able to slowly push German lines in the West, suffocating the Reich and liberating millions from Nazi rule. The leaders of the big 3 Allied powers also met at a series of successful conferences, that allowed them to coordinate their efforts and plan for a post-war order. At Tehran in 1943, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to maintain two fronts against Germany, setting the stage for the D-Day invasion. At Yalta in 1945, Stalin agreed to assist the United States in dealing with Japan after Germany surrendered. And at San Francisco in the same year, the Big Three were joined by 47 other countries, and the beleaguered League of Nations was replaced by a new international organization, the United Nations. Meanwhile, the walls continued to close in around Germany. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Facing the inevitability of his destruction, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, and his successors surrendered unconditionally to the Allies on May 8th. Around the globe, citizens of the Allied nations celebrated Victory in Europe, or VE Day. But for the United States, the war was not yet won. Japan continued to pose a threat in the Pacific. After the victory at Midway in 1942, the United States undertook a strategy of island hopping in the Pacific, whereby Allied forces led by the United States systematically recaptured Japanese-controlled islands by cutting them off from imperial supply lines. The strategy was effective, but it took time, and fighting on the islands was brutal and costly. But the United States was also working on an alternative to jungle warfare. In 1942, FDR had authorized the Manhattan Project, a colossal investment in nuclear research with the goal of producing an atomic weapon. In 1945, the scientists succeeded. The first nuclear bomb was successfully tested in New Mexico, and two more were manufactured. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States island hopping campaign was coming to a close. Early in 1945, the U.S. won a key victory at Iwo Jima, and most of the remaining Japanese forces retreated to the main island to defend it. Plans for a full-scale invasion of Japan were in the works, but thanks to the success of the Manhattan Project, an invasion was never ordered. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the new American president, Harry Truman, along with Churchill and Stalin, issued a firm warning to Japan: surrender unconditionally or face, quote, prompt and utter destruction. Japan ignored the ultimatum. Only days later, Truman authorized the deployment of an atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Take a look.
I saw an aircraft, like a tiny silver drop, entering the sky above Hiroshima. I instantly recognized it as an American plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual.
And I was counting 1, 2, 3.
I was wiping the desktop. That was when the bomb was dropped.
It took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded. And I think there wasn't a man in the airplane that wasn't either timing it with his watch or counting or doing something. I was sure the bomb was a dud. I was sure it wasn't going to work.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
Truman waited 3 days for the emperor to surrender. When he did not, the president ordered a second bombing at Nagasaki. The following day, Japan capitulated, and the war was over. Americans rejoiced, as it seemed the greatest threats to democracy had finally been defeated. But what about Truman's decision? Was it the right one? Let's consider his calculus. The war in 1945 was in its 6th year. It was already the most destructive and costly war in history. Japan had an army of 2 million soldiers and 70 million civilians. Japan had fostered a culture of unquestioned loyalty to the emperor, a loyalty for which many Japanese soldiers and perhaps civilians were readily willing to die. As Japan's situation had worsened in the Pacific, they increasingly employed suicide bombers called kamikazes to inflict maximum damage on U.S. ships and to die honorably for the empire. The prospect of a land invasion on Japan's main island was estimated to cost the United States upwards of 1 million casualties, not to mention the destruction that would inevitably come to the island and its people. Facing the prospect of that carnage, it isn't hard to see why Truman would exhaust all options before sending so many American soldiers to the grave. On the other hand, the ethics of Truman's decision are at best questionable. Of the hundreds of thousands killed or injured in the atomic attacks, most were civilians. The bombs did not distinguish soldier from civilian, or for that matter, women or children. The bombs leveled 2 cities that took years to recover and in some ways never did. And though it was an unknown effect at the time, thousands were subject to damaging levels of radiation. Truman's true motivation has also been a source of debate among historians. Some suggest that Truman dropped the bomb to send a message, not to Japan, but to Stalin and the Soviet Union, as a rivalry over post-war control was quickly developing between the two former allies. And what about the long-term consequences of the nuclear age? The use of the bomb touched off an arms race with the Soviet Union, and when the Russians produced a nuclear weapon of their own, tensions mounted, bringing the world to the brink of a nuclear exchange more than once. The debate over the atomic bomb is a true quandary of American history, and while no atomic weapon has been deployed in combat since, an estimated 13,000 nuclear warheads still exist. Whether they are ever called into service is in part your decision, one you'll make at the ballot box. Next time, we'll look at the effects of World War II on the American home front. See you then.